Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the history of the Church in the late medieval, early modern periods, moving into the reign of Pope 205, Gregory XII, reigned from 1406 to 1417, and he's the Pope who finally ended the Schism. The the Conclave of 1406 so there's still two sets of there's still Pedro de Luna, the anti-pope, in Avignon with his cardinals and supporters, but he's claiming to be the real pope. And then when the Roman pope died, the guy Innocent VII, we just finished in the last video, there's still Roman cardinals, and they are faced with the same prospect as the previously. Do they end the schism by just electing Pedro de Luna as the real pope and then bringing both together, or something else? Either both sets of cardinals reached the same conclusion independently, or, more likely, there had been clandestine correspondence between them that has not survived. What is clear from subsequent events is that both sets of cardinals realized that the schism had resulted in their own irrelevance. After all, how seriously could the average Catholic take church leadership when they witnessed a multi-decade spectacle of two men claiming to be in charge as pope, but neither able to exercise effective ecclesial governance? The 14 Roman cardinals made an agreement among themselves before casting ballots that whichever one of them was elected would abdicate to permit a new election if the anti-pope Pedro de Luna either died or himself agreed to simultaneous abdication. In light of this agreement, or after making this agreement, they proceeded with the election, and they chose one of their own, an 81-year-old cardinal. He was the cardinal of San Marco in Venice, baptized Angelo Correro, Correro. He accepted election on November 30th, 1406, as the 205th pope. He was born into the aristocracy of Venice in 1325. A typical feudalism, younger son given to the church by the family. He became Bishop of Castello in 1380, appointed to the College of Cardinals in 1405 because of his family connections. Although he was not just a parasite, he had earned. He was respected as a learned. Of course, he had the finest education possible. Yet, despite his wealth and all, he lived in a fairly austere life comparatively, and he did keep his vows, despite having been sent into the church at a young age by the family. He evidently either happened to have a genuine vocation, or he just embraced it as he grew. As Pope, he did not keep his baptismal name, so there's no Pope Angelo. He took the name of the reforming popes. He took the name Gregory, so this is Gregory XII of that name. And he chose it in honor of the previous Gregory, Gregory XI, who had ended the Avignon residence of the Holy See, which from their perspective was the previous crisis of the Church. In keeping with his resolve to end the schism, this newly elected Gregory XII sent a delegation to the anti-pope Pedro de Luna. His ambassador, both sets of ambassadors agreed on April 21st, 1407, that the two of them, Gregory and Pedro de Luna, would meet in person at Savona. That's sort of not exactly halfway, but it would be neutral ground. So for the sake of their pride, that neither one would want to go to the city where the other one was. So Savona is outside of Genoa, Genoa was a port in northwestern Italy, so it would be easy for both to get to by ship and then just go to Savona. The meeting was scheduled for November 1st, so they had plenty of time. The agreement was made on April 21st that the two would meet in Savona on November 1st, 1407. However, when it became clear that Pedro de Luna, the antipope, had no intention of abdicating, then Gregory backed out of the meeting. He said, we're not meeting in good faith. So he was prepared for a mutual abdication for the good of the church, but he would not just abdicate himself if Pedro de Luna did not. So the cardinals then decided to take matters into their own hands. 12 of Gregory's cardinals and 4 of Pedro de Luna's cardinals deserted their masters, and they met together in Pisa in Florence. There, they decided to end the schism by putting into practice the ecclesiology of Conciliarism, which we summarized in previous videos, put forward by Conrad von Gelnhausen and Jean Gerson. Both of them, at the time that they put forward these ideas, both of them had been on the faculty of the University of Paris. And so that's conciliar solution would be to summon a church council, inviting the secular rulers of Europe, as well as all the ranking ecclesiastics, to meet in order to impose a solution to the crisis, up to and including forcing abdication of both. Invitations were sent to both Pope Gregory and Pedro de Luna to come to this council at Pisa, but neither one agreed to attend, and neither one agreed to recognize the results of this council. They did not recognize it as a legitimate council. Nevertheless, a council opened in the city of Pisa, Tuscany, Italy, on March 25th, 1409. As this council was not summoned by a pope, it is a schismatic council. It's a pseudo-council. It's not one of the 21 ecumenical councils. Yet, it did have a surprising amount of support publicly, which, if nothing else, is evidence that many people still cared about the church and did want this resolved. And remember that, the Protestant movement hasn't happened yet, so technically all of Europe is Catholic. Well, at least all the king. I mean, there were enclaves of Jews and even some enclaves of Muslims in the trade cities. But as far at the level of the kingdoms, the church was established. The Catholic Church was the established church in all the kingdoms of Europe. So this Council of Pisa was attended by 4 patriarchs, 22 cardinals, 80 bishops, and 80 bishops physically went themselves, plus representatives of another 100 bishops, plus 87 abbots, 41 priors, and 300 lay theologians from various universities, Paris, Oxford, Cologne, and Toulouse. Joined representatives of the kings, the King of France, the kings didn't go, but the representatives from the King of France, the King of England, as well as the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also the King of Germany. Invitations were sent again after seeing all these people had come, and even the cardinals who initiated this may have been surprised at how many showed up. But once they had that, they thought, okay, now this has some credibility. So they re-invited Pope Gregory XII and Pedro de Luna, but again, neither agreed to attend or to recognize the council. So it proceeded without him. On June 5th, 1409, this Council of Pisa formally deposed both Gregory XII, the true pope, and Pedro de Luna, the antipope. Each of them, the council further condemned each of them for heresy, based on the argument that persistence in schism transforms into heresy the heresy of denying the will of Christ, that the church remain one, that the church remain united. Then the council proceeded to hold an election. And they elected a guy named Pietro Filargi, Phillargi. He was a Franciscan at the time. He was born on the island of Crete. He studied, got his theological training at Oxford University in England. He was a Franciscan initially, but he had been Cardinal Archbishop of Milan since 1402. And so he was elected. Well, not a real, but he accepted the council's election on June 26, 1409. Now, he took a papal name, but once again, a later real pope took that name, so I don't want to confuse things, so we'll just continue to call him the anti-pope, Pietro Filargi. Obviously, this election, this is not valid, so he is the 35th of the, so far, 39 anti-popes. The Council of Pisa was canonically invalid because it had not been summoned by a pope. But even if it had been legitimate, it would lack the authority to depose a sitting pope. That's the heresy of Conciliarism, that a council does have that authority, but that's not Catholic theology. And then they realized, so that everybody's proud, okay, we resolved the schism. But then they realized that they had no means of enforcing this decision of deposing Gregory and Pedro de Luna. So those two guys were still asserting that they were pope. So now the result of the Council of Pisa was, instead of two men claiming to be pope, the church now had the spectacle of three men claiming to be pope. The Pisan anti-pope Filargi had secular support in northern Italy, where he had been Archbishop of Milan. So he decided to force the issue by waging war, invading the papal state to force Gregory's abdication, or force Gregory to accept that he was deposed. Gregory's supporters started jumping ship. The rats started, fleeing the ship, and so he had no supporters. He was not militarily viable any longer in the city of Rome. So he fled to Gaetano in southern Italy, in the Kingdom of Naples, where he was offered the protection of the King of Naples. He arrived there in September of 1409. The forces of the anti-pope Filargi actually captured the city of Rome in January of 1410, an act which Filargi felt cemented his assertion of legitimacy. So not only had he been elected by a council he accepted, which had significant attendance, but now, okay, he's in Rome. And the real pope, well, he wouldn't have seen Israel, but the guy claiming to be the Roman pope ran away. Filargi died 5 months after this victory, on the 3rd of May, 1410. It is generally assumed, but has never been proven, that someone poisoned him. But in any case, he died. Then the Pisan cardinals, even though they saw that the other two, that Gregory and Pedro de Luna, were not going to recognize it, nevertheless, they met at Bologna to elect a successor to Filargi. So they perpetuated the schism. They elected one of their own, who accepted election on May 17th, 1410. He was a cardinal who had originally been one of Gregory XII's cardinals, but abandoned him. This guy was Baldassare Cosa, Cossa. This guy, Cosa, was born into the aristocracy of the Kingdom of Naples in southern Italy. He had made a fortune for himself as a condottiero, a leader of, mercenary commander of the naval variety, which is a pirate, essentially. Made his fortune as a pirate. He then decided to go into the church as a second, as a second career, a late vocation. He earned a doctorate in law, of all things, a former pirate, became a lawyer. He earned a doctorate from the University of Bologna, and then entered church service. Pope Boniface IX made him a cardinal in 1402. Believing himself to be the legitimate pope, he took a papal name. Now this one I will give you because it's going to be an issue later in the 20th century. So the name he took as pope was John the 23rd. Though his election was invalid, so in reality he was the 36th of the so far 39 anti-popes. And because of this guy, the former pirate, become lawyer, become cardinal, become anti-pope, this guy took John the 23rd, the name John the 23rd, even though he wasn't a real pope. No pope after him used the name John until Angelo Roncalli was elected as pope, and he took it. He took the name when he was elected in 1958. And so that John the 23rd is the one who summoned the Second Vatican Council. Okay, so back to that. This odious situation with three guys claiming to be pope, continued. In 1411, Gregory, who remember had fled Rome, was hiding out in the Kingdom of Naples. In 1411, he was forced to flee even that refuge when the King of Naples suffered a military defeat. Now that conflict was not connected to this church issue, but nevertheless, he suffered a defeat. His military was compromised, so he was not able to guarantee the Pope's safety. So Gregory then went on the run until he found refuge with the Lord of Rimini, Rimini, a guy named Carlo Malatesta, a layman, Carlo Malatesta, who proved to be one of the few decent human beings in this entire squalid episode. He offered sanctuary and protection to Gregory, who was the real pope but was abandoned by almost everyone. So Malatesta had put himself at great risk to do this. In the summer of 1413, the predictable, reliable, cyclical urban violence in the city of Rome forced the Pisan anti-pope Baldassare Cosa, the putative John the 23rd, to flee. In his turn, he had to flee the city of Rome. He sought refuge in the city of Florence. He started canvassing from Florence. He wrote letters. He started canvassing the monarchs of Europe for help, military help as well as financial help, and he discovered very little interest. After much effort, he eventually found one monarch willing to help him. This was the King of Hungary and Bohemia. And Bohemia is now the Czech Republic. This was King Sigismund, Sigimund. At the time, he had the two, Hungary and Bohemia. Later, this guy became also Holy Roman Emperor. Sigismund was willing to help Cosa, but there was a price. Sigismund wanted Cosa to summon a church council that would initiate reform of the church, putting the theology of Conciliarism into practice. Envisioning that this council would be controlled by secular monarchs and its reforms enforced by those monarchs, such a move would definitively end the two powers debate in favor of the temporal, in favor of the secular. Now, Cosa was vulnerable, so he agreed to the price, and he summoned what eventually became the Council of Constance. Okay, so this guy, at the time he summoned the council, he was not a real pope, but he was claiming to be pope, and he was recognized by some as pope. So in the normal course of things, one would think that this council he summoned was a fake council, was a pseudo-council. However, this Council of Constance is on the list of the 21 legitimate ecumenical councils. Now, the reason that happened is not because Cosa summoned it, but because of something else that happened later. So keep that in mind. So this Council of Constance met for 45 sessions for years, from November 5th, 1414, through April 22nd, 1417. On December 9th, Cosa summoned it on December 9th, 1413. And because of events that we're going to describe, it is part of it. Part of those of the meetings, part of those 45 sessions, are reckoned as the 16th Ecumenical Council. So it opened on November 5th, 1414. The council met in the Cathedral of Constance, which was a city in the Duchy of Baden, Germany at the time. It's on Lake Constance. Lake Constance is it's where like Switzerland, France, Germany, that all comes together, and there are many cities along the perimeter. Baden is one of them. Basel is another, and there's this Council of Constance. City of Constance. It initially was attended by 29 cardinals, over 100 lay theologians, 134 abbots, 183 bishops and archbishops. More ominously, Constance was attended by representatives of all the major powers of Europe, as by that point the other kings agreed with Sigismund that this was their chance to recreate the church in a much weakened state, perpetually subordinate to secular authority in each of the kingdoms. In its deliberations, the majority of the Council Fathers concluded by February 15th, 1415, that each of the three claimants must be brought to abdicate, meaning choose to step down on their own, rather than being deposed by a decree of the council, because Pisa had tried that and it didn't work. So the council fathers, well, wasn't yet, but the guys there at the council concluded they had to persuade all three of them to voluntarily abdicate, so that a fresh election could be held, and the church would be like a reset. The church could start over again. In order to prevent this from happening, one of the anti-popes, Baldassar Cosa, the putative John the 23rd, he did not want to step down. He thought that since he was the one that summoned the Council of Constance, that they would back him, that the council would make the other two guys step down, and that he would be recognized as pope. He didn't want to give up the papacy. So when he perceived this was the direction of the thought of the majority at the council, he fled Constance. He fled the city on March 21st, 1415, in hopes that the council would dissolve without him, without the pope they recognized as having called them into being. Instead, the council did not disband. Instead, they were furious at this, and they met. Now, in the list, this is the fourth session of the meeting of the council on March 30th, 1415. Now, at this point, it is not yet considered a legitimate council, so this fourth session is not binding in canon law, but I'm covering it historically because it's necessary to understand how the schism eventually ended. So on that session 4, March 30th, 1415, it issued a decree titled Haec Sancta, Haec, and Sancta, Sancta, just means this holy. So it's just the first two words of the decree. In this decree, the council formally declared the ecclesiology of conciliarism as being church policy. And the way they summarized conciliarism, first, that they, the council, or a church council, but in this case they represent the church, represent the totality of the faithful. Second, that their authority comes directly from God, because the authority of the people comes directly from God, and they are the representatives of the people, so therefore their authority comes directly from God. Third, that all the faithful, since they're representing the faithful, therefore all the faithful are bound by the decisions that they make, that they, the representatives of the faithful, make. Fourth, that the Pope, the one they were recognizing as Pope, Baldassar Cosa, the putative John the 23rd, even though we know he was an anti-pope, but they declared that even though they recognized him as Pope, neither he nor any other Pope had the authority to disband a council without the consent of the council. Now, obviously, with no legitimate Pope connected with this session, the decree is not valid. But it was put in writing, it was publicized, it was known. And its declaration is instructive as to the attitude of Europe, because all the kingdoms are represented here toward the church. So this is another step toward the Protestant movement. So nothing just happens. So remember, Martin Luther did in 1517 just did not materialize out of nowhere. It was long, very long period of development, sequence of events operating on multiple levels, and this is one of them, the relationship between the church and the state. You know, with that later, the Protestant ecclesiology, that the church is subordinate to the state, that did not just materialize out of nowhere. Okay. Yet the council, without even the anti-pope that summoned them, the council moved to act on its presumed authority and started legislating on other matters. So the council was called to end the schism, but Sigismund and the other kings agreed to support this because they wanted more. Yeah, they saw this as an opportunity to remake the church in a different image, and one church is completely subordinate to each king in his realm. And so they start pronouncing on matters of they start teaching. They start, legislating in matters of theology. Session 8, May 4th, 1415. The Council of Constance condemned two sets of propositions extracted from the writings of John Wycliffe. Now, Wycliffe was already dead. We covered him previously. But his writings survived and were very popular, as we covered, in England. 45 propositions were extracted in the first set, and then another 210 propositions were extracted for the second set of condemnations from Wycliffe's writings. And they condemned him. So the council condemned these propositions as heretical and Wycliffe as a heretic, even though he was deceased. The council then demanded that Wycliffe's bones be exhumed, dug up, removed from sacred ground, and scattered in the field somewhere else, somewhere that is not sacred ground. Baldassar Cosa, the putative John the 23rd, truly anti-pope, but who they recognized as the real pope, just one that had fled the council. He was captured in May of 1415, and the council put him on trial. Even though they recognized him as pope, but they put him on trial. He was on 44 charges. He was charged with heresy, simony, schism, maladministration, theft, embezzlement, nepotism, sorcery, sodomy, adultery, fornication, waste, murder, piracy, perjury, unnatural acts, and bringing scandal to the universal church. He was found guilty of all of this, and he was deposed as pope at session 12 of the council, May 29th, 1415. He was kept in prison. Now, even though some of those, like murder and piracy, those were capital crimes according to the laws of the day. So others, convicted of all that would have been put to death, but for some reason they didn't. He was kept in prison, and he stayed in prison for 3 years until he bribed his way out to escape. And we'll meet him again, but in case I forget, later he submitted. Finally, he submitted, repented, and went to find a later Pope, Martin V. And Pope Martin V, forgave him and accepted him back into the church, and he died. Cosa eventually died in union with the church on November 22nd, 1419. But okay, sticking with 1415. So now, having deposed and imprisoned their pope, the pope that summoned them into existence, the Council of Constance, then accepted ambassadors from the almost forgotten real pope, Gregory XII. These ambassadors were, one, a loyal layman, the Lord of Rimini, whom we've already met, that was providing shelter and protection for Gregory, Carlo Malatesta. And there was one cardinal, John Domenici. Through these two representatives, these ambassadors delivered Gregory's message to the council. And this is why part of the Council of Constance is considered a legitimate council. So through them, he offered the following deal. He said, I as Pope, I as the real Pope of the Roman line, will officially summon you, the Council of Constance, into existence, so that you will have canonical legitimacy in the Roman line. Then I, as Gregory, I will abdicate. And you, as the council, can elect a successor. And I will announce beforehand that I will not accept election. So this is not a game just to legitimize me and keep me in power. That I'll announce beforehand I'm withdrawing myself from consideration. In exchange, the proposal was that the council, would acknowledge the truth that he had been the lawful pope from the time of his election, and his predecessors in the Roman line were the legitimate pope, and that they, as a council, would make no effort to undo any of his actions as pope or the actions of his predecessors in the Roman line. The council accepted this deal. Gregory then became the 8th pope to abdicate, and he was the last pope to abdicate until the recent Pope Benedict abdicated. Gregory abdicated on July 4th, 1415, at session 14 of the Council of Constance. So this act ended the Great Schism. In retrospect, it ended the Great Schism. In retirement, he was given the title of Cardinal Archbishop of Porto, which would give him an income. And he was allowed to retire in Ancona, the March of Ancona, which is on the eastern Adriatic coast of Italy. And he lived there for another 2 years, died on October 18th, 1417. But meanwhile, when he abdicated, July 4th, 1415, the next step was Pedro de Luna. So delegates from the council were sent to him, to Pedro de Luna, to ask him to voluntarily resign, saying, okay, it's done. One of the guys is in jail. A second one has abdicated on his own for the good of the church, so we're asking you to do the same. And, just do exactly what Gregory did. Just abdicate. You don't have to admit you were wrong or that to just abdicate and announce that you will not accept. You're withdrawing your candidacy so the church can start fresh. But Pedro de Luna said no. He refused. So the schism, I say Gregory's abdication ended the schism because even though Pedro de Luna continued to claim to be pope, after Gregory's abdication, with representatives of all the realms of Europe, of Christendom there, no one was recognizing Pedro de Luna anymore. So he was just there claiming to be pope, but he didn't have support to perpetuate. So the schism actually ended, in the sense that all the realms of Europe now recognized the Roman line. And he continued. He died as a curiosity years later in 1423. He never did reconcile with the church. Okay, back to the council. Having recognized Gregory as the legitimate pope and entered into the record his abdication, the council, canonically, the council should have done what a council does if a pope dies when it's in session, and should just suspend operations in order to hold a new election. That's like Vatican II. The pope who summoned Vatican II, the real John the 23rd, he died during the council. So the council was suspended. They held an election, and then it's up to the next pope if he wants to continue the council. Now, in the case of Vatican II, the next pope was Paul VI, who did want to continue the council. He did continue it. But that's what Constance should have done. Immediately suspended, hold an election, and see if the next pope would continue the council or not. That's not what they did. Instead, the council decided to continue meeting without a pope and to continue its role in legislating matters of theology, which is the background for the execution by incineration of Jan Hus, Janhus. Jan Hus was a Bohemian, ethnically Bohemian, which is now the Czech Republic. He was an ordained priest. He lived from 1369 to 1415. He had been so heavily influenced by the writings of John Wycliffe that he reproduced, quoted verbatim, large sections of Wycliffe's works in his own writings. And since Wycliffe's works were condemned by this council as heretical, the council then summoned Jan Hus as a priest, teaching Wycliffe's theology. So, okay, Wycliffe's deceased. His writings were condemned already, but you are still teaching it. So they summoned Hus as a priest to answer charges of heresy and offer him the chance to recant. The council offered him a safe conduct for that purpose. So Hus was born in the present-day Czech Republic. He graduated from the University of Prague, and he became a reforming priest. At session 15 of the Council of Constance, on July 6, 1415, a list of 30 propositions were extracted from Hus's work, read into the record of the council, and condemned as heresy. These were extracted from his magnum opus, titled On the Church. They were condemned. And in the condemnation, the council quoted from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 17, about the bad tree bearing bad fruit, as being fulfilled by Hus, following the erroneous doctrines of the now condemned, deceased English heretic, John Wycliffe. The condemned propositions of Jan Hus read like a preview of the Protestant movement. For example, Hus believed in predestination, as Calvin, Jean Calvin later would. Hus argued for universal communion at Mass under both species. He taught that a priest could not be prevented from preaching, and that if a priest was ordered to stop preaching, even by a pope, the priest had a right and a duty to obey his conscience instead. That his conscience, the authority of his conscience, superseded the authority of the church hierarchy. Further, Hus stated that any person in authority, this is church and state, any person in authority, loses that authority if they are in a state of mortal sin. Further, Huss denied that Peter was the first pope. He denied that the popes are vicars of Christ, that they have any, unique role. He dismissed the papacy as an institution created by the imperial power of the ancient Roman emperors once they converted to Christianity. He revived the Donatist heresy, arguing that sacraments performed by priests in a state of mortal sin are invalid. He revived the Monophysite heresy in arguing that the divinity and the humanity of Jesus are blended into one Christ, that Christ is not true God and true man, that Christ has this a hybrid nature. Huss argued that preaching and the sacraments must be in the vernacular, which in itself was not heretical, but disobedience was. And all this was condemned. So this was all condemned by the council. Huss was informed of that this was condemned, and he was offered the chance to recant, to accept the ruling of the council and recant. He refused. So he was executed by incineration. He was burned at the stake at sunset on July 6th, 1415. His ashes were thrown into the Rhine River. Now, remember, he had been given a safe conduct by the council. So this is a violation of the safe conduct. They did it, the council did it because of King Sigismund, who, remember, one of his titles is King of Bohemia, which is where Huss was, and he saw Huss as a troublemaker. He said, okay, he's here, I'm not going to let him go. So the council just did what Sigismund wanted and executed him. So Sigismund could have, and Huss was very popular. That's why Sigismund had not just, captured him and killed him himself. He saw this as a perfect opportunity. Sigismund could say, oh, hey, it's not me, it was the council that did this. Now, there's no sitting pope. Now, of course, the church gets blamed for this, but there's no sitting pope. And this council was acting inappropriately. It should not have been doing any of this. It should have just stopped, elected the new pope, and then if that new pope wanted to continue the council, then the council would. Now, it might have happened anyway. It might have done that, and then the new pope, yes, continue the council, yes, put Huss on trial, yes, I'll do what Sigismund wants and just waste this guy here. But anyway, they didn't follow proper procedure. The council then occupied itself with many other matters of a political nature until it got around to formally deposing Pedro de Luna at Session 37, July 26, 1417, still without having elected a new pope. But before doing that, before electing a new pope, the council enacted 2 more decrees with the aim of enshrining conciliarism as official church teaching. But since they did it without a sitting pope, it's not binding, it's not canonical. But historically it's significant, and it is going to affect what subsequent popes do and have to do later in the early medieval period. Now, when I say have to do, they did not canonically have to do it, but for practical reasons they did, as we'll see. So one of those decrees is just called by its the Latin name, Frequens Generalium Conciliorum, or simply Frequens, the decree Frequens. This was passed by the council Session 39 on October 9th, 1417. So the title is from the first sentence of the decree. The frequent holding of general councils is a preeminent means of cultivating the Lord's patrimony. It roots out briars and thorns and thistles of heresy, errors, and schisms, corrects deviations, reforms what is deformed, and produces a richly fertile crop for the Lord's vineyard. That being the case, the council ruled that councils must in future be held on a regular basis, and even stipulated a time frame, that the first must be held 5 years after their council, Constance, ended. Then, 7 years after that, another one would be held. And then after that, every 10 years, the church would have to have a council. Now, as we'll see, this pattern was not followed in perpetuity, and nor was it, nor should it have been, because the council did overstep its proper authority in attempting to bind future pontiffs, or even to pronounce something like this when there was no sitting pope. The second of these decrees, done when the church was still sede vacante, was the decree Sacrosancta Synodus Constantiensis. This was session 40 on October 30th, 1417. Again, named for the first sentence, quote, "The Most Holy Synod of Constance declares and decrees that the future Supreme Roman Pontiff, who by God's grace is to be elected very soon, together with this sacred council, or those to be deputed by the individual nations, is bound to reform the church in its head and in the Roman curia, according to justice and the good government of the church." End quote. The decree then goes on to list 18 areas of reform, all of which were legitimate. I mean, because we've seen the many feudalism problems, so the church, did need to fix these things. And so this list of 18, it reads like a table of contents of the future Council of Trent. As sadly, it was to be 150 years before these needed reforms were made. And the list includes reform of qualifications to be admitted to the College of Cardinals, annates of the episcopal offices to the Holy See, benefices with care of souls, the procedure for appealing cases to the curia, reform of the chancery, the papal chancery, the curia, review of another benefice problem, the awarding multiple benefices, creating a procedure for deposing a pope, eliminating simony, the sale of ecclesiastical offices, misuse of dispensations, indulgences, tithes, etc. Like frequens, the decree Sacrosancta was enacted with no sitting pope, so subsequent popes did not feel, and indeed were not, bound to follow it. But if rational reform in many of these areas had been made, it is possible, it is entirely possible, that the Protestant movement would not have happened. As this is exactly 100 years before the Protestant, this is 1417, and Luther, the 95 Theses was 100 years later in 1517. So 100, and so if the church had fixed all of this 100 years earlier, it's possible the Protestant movement would not have happened, and the church not been divided like that. But anyway, that's not what happened. On November 11th, 1417, the College of Cardinals came together to carry out the election of a new pope. Because of the circumstances, this conclave was unique. It was necessary, practically necessary, that all the powers, all the kingdoms of Europe recognize whoever the next pope was, so that a rival would not find support from a disgruntled king and then just cause a renewal of the schism. So after lengthy debate, it was agreed that the 1417 conclave would consist of 52 individuals, 22 cardinals, drawn from both those appointed from the Roman and the Avignon claimants, plus 39 non-cardinals who represented the major powers of Europe, kingdoms, independent duchies, principalities, etc. Now, some of those 30 were clerics. There were bishops or abbots or whatever from those realms, but there were some laymen who actually participated in this conclave. So, session 41 of the council, November 8th, 1417, was the conclave. They elected Odo, well, his baptismal name was Odo Colonna. It's Oddo, Colonna, Collonna. He accepted election on November 11th, which is the feast of St. Martin of Tours. So he did not keep his baptismal name, so there's no Pope Odo. Instead, he's Pope Martin, fifth of that name, Pope Martin V. And he is the 206th Pope. And as Pope, he formally closed the Council of Constance on April 22nd, 1418. With that, finally, the Avignon period and the Great Schism were over. Yet the damage proved to be irreparable. By the time it closed, now all the pieces were in the ether. All the pieces were floating in the milieu. All the pieces of the future Protestant movement were there. Now it would take a century for the right man in the right place at the right time to synthesize all of it and make the Protestant movement public. And that was Martin Luther in 1517. Then when that happened, the church was divided, and that division so far is permanent, 500 years later. Okay. So next, so that concluded and went beyond the reign of Pope Gregory XII. So he's the one that concluded it. And even though we've seen the election of Martin, I'll do a whole separate video on Martin V as Pope, because he was important in his own right, not just as the guy who closed the council. So we'll conclude here and pick up with Martin V next time. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.